This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Robert Browning by G.K. Chesterton. Section 12, Chapter 4, Browning in Italy, Part 2. Browning, as we have said, was in Italy at the time of the break-up of one part of this frozen continent of the non-possumus. Austria's hold in the north of Italy was part of that elaborate and comfortable and wholly cowardly and unmeaning compromise which the Holy Alliance had established, and which it believed without doubt in its solid unbelief would last until the day of judgment, though it's difficult to imagine what the Holy Alliance thought would happen then. But almost of a sudden affairs had begun to move strangely, and the despotic princes and their chancellors discovered with a great deal of astonishment that they were not living in the old age of the world, but to all appearance in a very unmanageable period of its boyhood, in an age of ugliness and routine, in a time when diplomatists and philosophers alike tended to believe that they had a list of all human types. There began to appear men who belong to the morning of the world, men whose movements have a national breadth and beauty, who act symbols and become legends while they are alive. Garibaldi, in his red shirt, rode in an open carriage along the front of a hostile fort, calling to the coachman to drive slower, and not a man dared to fire a shot at him. Mazzini poured out upon Europe a new mysticism of humanity and liberty, and was willing, like some passionate Jesuit of the 16th century, to become in its cause either a philosopher or a criminal. Cavour arose with a diplomacy which was more thrilling and picturesque than war itself. These men had nothing to do with an age of the impossible. They have passed, their theories along with them, as all things pass. But since then we have had no men of their type precisely, at once large and real and romantic and successful. Gordon was a possible exception. They were the last of the heroes. When Browning was first living in Italy, a telegram which had been sent to him was stopped on the frontier and suppressed on account of his known sympathy with the Italian Liberals. It is almost impossible for people living in a commonwealth like ours to understand how a small thing like that will affect a man. It was not so much the obvious fact that a great practical injury was really done to him, that the telegram might have altered all his plans in matters of vital moment. It was, over and above that, the sense of a hand laid on something personal and essentially free. Tyranny like this is not the worst tyranny, but it is the most intolerable. It interferes with men, not in the most serious matters, but precisely in those matters in which they most resent interference. It may be illogical for men to accept cheerfully unpardonable public scandals, benighted educational systems, bad sanitation, bad lighting, a blundering and inefficient system of life, and yet to resent the tearing up of a telegram or a postcard. But the fact remains that the sensitiveness of men is a strange and localized thing, and there is hardly a man in the world who would not rather be ruled by despots chosen by lot and live in a city like a medieval ghetto than be forbidden by a policeman to smoke another cigarette or sit up a quarter of an hour later. Hardly a man who would not feel inclined in such case to raise a rebellion for a caprice for which he did not really care a straw. Unmeaning and muddle-headed tyranny in small things, that is the thing which, if extended over many years, is harder to bear and hope through than the massacres of September. And that was the nightmare of vexatious triviality which was lying over all cities of Italy that were ruled by the bureaucratic despotisms of Europe. The history of the time is full of spiteful and almost childish struggles about the humming of a tune or the wearing of a colour, the arrest of a journey or the opening of a letter. And there can be little doubt that Browning's temperament under these conditions was not of the kind to become more indulgent. and there grew in him a hatred of the imperial and ducal and papal systems of Italy, which sometimes passed the necessities of liberalism, and sometimes even transgressed its spirit. The life which he and his wife lived in Italy was extraordinarily full and varied. When we consider the restrictions under which one at least of them had always lain, they met and took delight, notwithstanding their exile, in some of the most interesting people of their time: Ruskin, Cardinal Manning, and Lord Lytton. Browning, in a most characteristic way, enjoyed the society of all of them, arguing with one, agreeing with another, sitting up all night by the bedside of a third. It has frequently been stated that the only difference that ever separated Mr. and Mrs. Browning was upon the question of spiritualism. That statement must, of course, be modified and even contradicted if it means that they never differed, that Mr. Browning never thought an Act of Parliament good when Mrs. Browning thought it bad, that Mr. Browning never thought bread stale when Mrs. Browning thought it new. Such unanimity is not only inconceivable, it is immoral, and as a matter of fact there is an abundant evidence that their marriage constituted something like that ideal marriage, an alliance between two strong and independent forces. They differed, in truth, about a great many things. For example, about Napoleon III, whom Mrs. Browning regarded with an admiration which would have been somewhat beyond the deserts of Sir Galahad, and whom Browning, with his emphatic liberal principles, could never pardon for the coup d'état. If they differed on spiritualism in a somewhat more serious way than this, the reason must be sought in qualities which were deeper and more elemental in both their characters than any mere matter of opinion. Mrs. Orr, in her excellent Life of Browning, states that the difficulty arose from Mrs. Browning's firm belief in psychical phenomena and Browning's absolute refusal to believe even in their possibility. Another writer who met them at this time says, "Browning cannot believe, and Mrs. Browning cannot help believing." This theory, that Browning's aversion to the spiritualist cycle arose from an absolute denial of the tenability of such a theory of life and death, has in fact often been repeated, but it is exceedingly difficult to reconcile it with Browning's character. He was the last man in the world to be intellectually deaf to a hypothesis merely because it was odd. He had friends whose opinions covered every description of madness, from the French legitimatism of de Rupert Monclar to the republicanism of Landor. Intellectually, he may be said to have had a zest for heresies. It is difficult to impute an attitude of mere impenetrable negation to a man who had expressed with sympathy the religion of Caliban and the morality of Time's Revenges. It is true that at this time of the first popular interest in spiritualism, a feeling existed among many people of a practical turn of mind, which can only be called a superstition against believing in ghosts. But intellectually speaking, Browning would probably have been one of the most tolerant and curious in regard to the new theories, whereas the popular version of the matter makes him unusually intolerant and negligent even for that time. The fact was, in all probability, that Browning's aversion to the spiritualists had little or nothing to do with spiritualism. It arose from quite a different side of his character, his uncompromising dislike of what is called Bohemianism, of eccentric or slovenly cliques, of those straggling camp followers of the arts who exhibit dubious manners and dubious morals, of all abnormality and of all irresponsibility. Anyone, in fact, who wishes to see what it was that Browning disliked need only to do two things. First, he should read the memoirs of David Home, the famous spiritualist medium with whom Browning came in contact. These memoirs constitute a more thorough and artistic self-revelation than any monologue that Browning ever wrote. The ghosts, the raps, the flying hands, the phantom voices are infinitely the most respectable and infinitely the most credible part of the narrative. But the bragging, the sentimentalism, the moral and intellectual foppery of the composition is everywhere, culminating, perhaps, in the disgusting passage in which Home describes Mrs. Browning as weeping over him and assuring him that all her husband's actions in the matter have been adopted against her will. It is in this kind of thing that we find the roots of the real anger of Browning. He did not dislike spiritualism, but spiritualists. The second point on which anyone wishing to be just in the matter should cast an eye is the record of the visit which Mrs. Browning insisted on making, while on their honeymoon in Paris, to the house of George Sand. Browning felt, and to some extent expressed, exactly the same aversion to his wife mixing with the circle of George Sand which he afterwards felt at her mixing with the circle of Home. The society was of the ragged red diluted with the low theatrical, men who worshipped George Sand as Jean Baz between an oath and an ejection of saliva. When we find that a man did not object to any number of Jacobites or atheists, but objected to the French Bohemian poets and to the early occultist mediums as friends for his wife, we shall surely be fairly right in concluding that he objected not to an opinion, but to a social tone. The truth was that Browning had a great many admirably Philistine feelings, and one of them was a great relish for his responsibilities towards his wife. He enjoyed being a husband. This is quite a distinct thing from enjoying being a lover, though it will scarcely be found apart from it. But like all good feelings, it has its possible exaggerations, and one of them is this almost morbid healthiness in the choice of friends for his wife. David Home, the medium, came to Florence about 1857. Mrs. Browning undoubtedly threw herself into psychical experiments with great ardour at first, and Browning equally undoubtedly opposed and at length forbade the enterprise. He did not do so, however, until he had attended one séance at least, at which a somewhat ridiculous event occurred, which is described in Holmes' memoirs with a gravity even more absurd than the incident. Toward the end of the proceedings a wreath was placed in the centre of the table, and, the lights being lowered, it was caused to rise slowly into the air, and after hovering for some time to move towards Mrs. Browning, and at length to alight upon her head. As the wreath was floating in her direction, her husband was observed abruptly to cross the room and stand beside her. One would think it was sufficiently a natural action on the part of the man, whose wife was the centre of a weird and disturbing experiment, genuine or otherwise. But Mr. Home gravely asserts that it was generally believed that Browning had crossed the room in the hope that the wreath would alight on his head, and that from the hour of its disobliging refusal to do so dated the whole of his goaded and malignant aversion to spiritualism. The idea of the very conventional and somewhat bored Robert Browning running about the room after a wreath in the hope of putting his head into it is one of the genuine gleams of humour in this rather foolish affair. Browning could be fairly violent, as we know, both in poetry and in conversation, but it would be almost too terrible to conjecture what he would have felt and said if Mr. Holmes' wreath had alighted on his head. Next day, according to Holmes' account, he called on the hostess of the previous night in what the writer calls a ridiculous state of excitement, and told her apparently that she must excuse him if he and his wife did not attend any more gatherings of the kind. What actually occurred is not, of course, quite easy to ascertain, for the account in Holmes' memoirs principally consists of noble speeches made by the medium, which would seem either to have reduced Browning to a pulverized silence, or else to have failed to attract his attention. But there can be no doubt that the general upshot of the affair was that Browning put his foot down, and the experiment ceased. There can be little doubt that he was justified in this. Indeed, he was probably even more justified if the experiments were genuine psychical mysteries than if they were the hocus-pocus of a charlatan. He knew his wife better than posterity can be expected to do, but even posterity can see that she was the type of woman so much adapted to the purposes of men like Home as to exhibit almost invariably either a great craving for such experiences or a great terror of them. Like many geniuses, but not all, she lived naturally upon something like a borderland, and it is impossible to say that if Browning had not interposed when she was becoming hysterical, she might not have ended in an asylum. The whole of this incident is very characteristic of Browning, but the real characteristic note in it, as above suggested, has been to some extent missed. When some 7 years afterwards he produced Mr. Sludge the Medium, every one supposed that it was an attack upon spiritualism and the possibility of its phenomena. As we shall see when we come to that poem, this is a wholly mistaken interpretation of it. But what is really curious is that most people have assumed that a dislike of Holmes's investigations implies a theoretic disbelief in spiritualism. It might, of course, imply a very firm and serious belief in it. As a matter of fact, it did not imply this in Browning, but it may perfectly well have implied an agnosticism which admitted the reasonableness of such things. Home was infinitely less dangerous as a dexterous swindler than he was as a bad or foolish man in possession of unknown or ill-comprehended powers. It is surely curious to think that a man must object to exposing his wife to a few conjuring tricks, but could not be afraid of exposing her to the loose and nameless energies of the universe. Browning's theoretic attitude in the matter was, therefore, in all probability, quite open and unbiased. His was a peculiar, hospitable intellect. If anyone had told him of the spiritualist theory, or theories 100 times more insane, as things held by some sect of Gnostics in Alexandria, or of heretical Talmudists at Antwerp, he would have delighted in those theories, and would have very likely adopted them. But Greek Gnostics and Antwerp Jews do not dance round a man's wife, and wave their hands in her face, and send her into swoons and trances, about which nobody knows anything rational or scientific. It was simply the stirrings in Browning of a certain primal masculine feelings, far beyond the reach of argument, things that lie so deep that if they are hurt, though there may be no blame and no anger, there is always pain. Browning did not like spiritualism to be mentioned for many years. End of section 12.